Welcome to the podcast, to preserve, protect, and defend the soul of America. I am Alex.
And I am Sam.
The topic we shall discuss in today's show, American BBQ regional rivalries and the politics of pit culture.
Yeah, and when you first hear that, you probably just think of, like, a sunny Saturday, right? A cold drink, hot dogs sizzling over charcoal in the backyard.
Right, totally. Just a basic weekend cookout.
Exactly. We view it as this really simple leisure activity. But the source material we're diving into today, it completely shatters that expectation. I mean, it makes this incredibly rigorous argument that true American barbecue isn't just a cooking method, and it's definitely not a suburban party.
No, not at all. The text argues it's arguably the only white, genuine, indigenous culinary art form that America has produced, which is a huge claim.
It really is. And more importantly, it acts as this cultural magnifying glass. Like, when you look closely at the smoke, the specific cuts of meat, and the people who actually tended those fires across the centuries, you're looking at a map, a really complex map of American migration, race, class, identity.
You were essentially going to explore how something as primal as cooking meat over a live fire became a living language of the American experience for you, the listener. It's fascinating.
It really is.
But, before we even get into that history, we have to address how incredibly confusing the very word is. Like, just think about it. If you're not American, or honestly, even if you are, the way we use the word barbecue makes absolutely zero linguistic sense.
Oh, it's total linguistic chaos.
Right. We use it as a noun, like, I'm eating barbecue for lunch. We use it as a verb, I'm going to barbecue this chicken. We use it as an adjective, pass the barbecue sauce. And then we use it for an event. Like, hey, we're going to a barbecue on Sunday. It's just this massive catch-all term for literally anything happening outside with food.
Yeah, it's a mess. But the text draws a very hard, historically grounded line in the sand about what true barbecue actually is.
Thank goodness for that.
Right, so the authentic historical definition, which, by the way, traditional pitmasters in North Carolina, Texas, Memphis, they will fiercely defend this to this day. It's incredibly specific. It's the slow, meditative, technically demanding process of cooking meat using wood-generated smoke and indirect heat.
So we are definitely not talking about grilling burgers for 20 minutes over a roaring flame.
No, absolutely not. We're talking about many hours, sometimes 12 to 16 hours, sometimes multiple days. It's a fundamental transformational process, You're taking the absolute toughest, humblest cuts of an animal, and through the sheer alchemy of time, moisture, and wood smoke, you turn them into something just completely transcendent.
And to really understand that alchemy, we actually have to go back much further than I think most people realize. Because, the story doesn't start with European settlers in Jamestown.
No, it doesn't.
And it doesn't even start with enslaved Africans, although, as we'll see, both of those groups are completely central to the development of what you'd eat in a restaurant today. But it begins with the indigenous peoples of the Americas, like thousands of years before any European ships even thought about crossing the Atlantic.
Exactly. The archaeological record is absolutely definitive here. Indigenous peoples throughout North and South America possessed incredibly sophisticated techniques for slow cooking and smoking meat. And this wasn't just a utilitarian way to get dinner on the table.
Right, it had deeper meaning.
Yeah, it was deeply embedded in their ceremonial and cultural lives. For instance, the text points out that when Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, his expeditions encountered the Taíno people. And the Spanish chroniclers actually meticulously documented how the Taíno were cooking meat, usually fish, iguanas, small mammals.
And they were doing it on this very specific structure, right?
Yes. A framework of woven green wood sticks that were elevated well above a smoldering fire. And the Taíno word for this wooden structure was barabacode.
Barabacode. You can literally hear the phonetic evolution right there. It sounds so close to what we say today.
You really can. Now, linguists debate the exact journey of that specific word, but the core technology, that structural concept of elevating meat over indirect smoky heat, is undeniably the direct ancestor of the American culinary tradition.
And it wasn't just an isolated Caribbean thing either.
No, not at all. If you look at the Plains tribes in North America, they were hunting bison. You don't just throw a 2,000-pound animal on a skillet, right?
Yeah, that's not going to work.
Exactly. So they developed highly advanced methods for cooking these massive animals over long, slow fires, which honestly looks remarkably similar to what a modern Texas pitmaster does with a huge beef brisket today.
Wow. wow. And then you have the southeastern tribes too, right? The Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek. These are the peoples who inhabited the exact geographic regions that would later become the undisputed heartlands of America's most famous barbecue style.
Yes, exactly the same regions.
So long before European colonizers arrived, these tribes were already using local hardwoods like hickory and oak to slowly smoke and cook. Well, actually not pork yet, but venison, bear, wild game. They were laying the literal geographic groundwork for the flavor profiles we fight about on the internet today.
It's incredible, and it's vital to pause here, I think, and consider the social dimensions of this early indigenous cooking, because it sets the permanent template for everything that follows in American history.
How so?
Well, think about it. When you cook an animal slowly over 12 or 14 hours, you're forced to wait. And human beings rarely wait alone. The process intrinsically creates a social occasion. The fire becomes a gravitational center.
People just naturally congregate around it?
Exactly. They talk, they share resources, they tell stories, and the person tending that fire steps into a very specific, elevated social role. They're not just a cook in a back room anymore. They become a host, a guardian of the communal warmth.
It's so deeply ingrained in the human psyche, isn't it? The fire is the center of the community. It forces this shared experience.
Precisely. And those social dynamics, the slow fire as a gathering point overseen by an honored practitioner, they survived centuries of upheaval. They survived colonization, chattel slavery, the Great Migration, and they're still surviving modern commercialization today.
Okay, so let's unpack the collision of those ancient indigenous techniques with European colonization. Because the source material reveals one of the most fascinating historical ironies I think I have ever encountered.
Oh, the pig story.
The pig story.
Yeah.
So in the 16th century, you have these brutal Spanish expeditions moving through the American Southeast.
Yeah.
Hernando de Soto is the most infamous example. He's carving this violent path through what is now Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee in the late 1530s. And they're observing indigenous peoples cooking meat.
Right, they're taking notes on the Baraba Code.
But they're also bringing their own traditions and, crucially, their own livestock. So walk us through this.
Yeah, this is where the pig enters the narrative, and it's just a staggering piece of ecological history. When De Soto landed in Florida in 1539, he brought a highly specific inventory of supplies, and that included exactly 13 pigs.
Wait, literally just 13?
Just 13. They were intended as an emergency food supply. But as we know, pigs are incredibly adaptable. So by the time De Soto died 3 years later during the expedition, that herd had exploded to several hundred.
That is wild.
And over the decades, many of those pigs escaped into the dense southern woodlands, or they were just abandoned.
Okay, and here is where the ultimate aha moment hit me while reading the chapter. We really need to sit with this for a second. So the feral hog, which became the absolute centerpiece of Southern barbecue culture, is quite literally an invasive colonial inheritance.
Yes.
That's culinary irony at its finest. You have this animal that was violently introduced into a delicate, established ecosystem. It roams wild, reproduces endlessly, tears up the native flora, and then it eventually becomes the definitive ingredient in the South's most cherished culinary tradition.
It's amazing.
The very symbol of regional Southern authenticity, the thing people will literally get into fistfights over, is an invasive species brought over by a Spanish conquistador.
It's brilliant, right? It perfectly illustrates how complex and layered cultural history actually is. Nothing is purely one thing or the other. It's all synthesis and collision and adaptation. And that brings us right into the colonial era, the 17th and 18th centuries, where this synthesis really starts to take on a recognizable form.
Right, we move from indigenous communal fires to these massive orchestrated political events.
Exactly. Colonial Virginia is essentially where the American barbecue, as a large-scale social and political institution, is born. We're talking about massive events. Whole hogs, or sometimes multiple animals, cooked over massive, freshly dug pit fires to feed dozens, sometimes hundreds of people.
And these weren't just for fun, right? They were heavily utilized by the colonial elite, the wealthy planters, to project wealth and political influence. It was the ultimate political flex.
Oh, it was a highly calculated flex. In an era before mass media, feeding a massive crowd was understood as a highly effective form of political persuasion. George Washington actually wrote extensively in his diaries about attending these barbecues. He would ride for miles just to show up.
Wow, so there were major social calendar events.
Huge. And these weren't casual afternoon cookouts. They were logistical behemoths. They spanned multiple days of preparation. Thomas Jefferson spent exorbitant amounts of money hosting barbecues at Monticello to grease the wheels of his political ambitions.
And it continued well past the Founding Fathers, too.
No, yeah. From Andrew Jackson to Abraham Lincoln, virtually every significant political fetish of the antebellum era utilized the massive public barbecue to build their voter base.
But the text highlights this massive, glaring structural paradox at the heart of this early political barbecue culture. And to explain it, the author introduces this concept of herrenvolk democracy.
Yeah, that's a vital, really challenging concept for understanding this era. Herrenvolk democracy refers to a socio-political system that preaches absolute egalitarianism, democratic equality, and brotherhood for the dominant group, which in this case is white men, while being entirely structurally dependent on the subjugation and enslavement of another group.
So if you really visualize this scene at one of these 18th century political barbecues, that concept makes chilling sense.
It really does.
Imagine the clearing in the woods. You have the incredibly wealthy white plantation owner standing shoulder to shoulder with the poor, working-class white yeoman farmer who owns no land. And they're sharing a meal, bonding over the meat, feeling this profound sense of democratic brotherhood and political equality. It feels like the American dream in action.
Right on the surface.
But underneath it all, the entire spectacle, the immense physical labor of digging the trenches, chopping the massive cords of hardwood, slaughtering the animals, managing the blistering fires through the humid night, and actually cooking the food. All of that was performed entirely by enslaved black people. The labor was completely invisible to the political narrative of the event. These white men bonded over a feast that was conjured into existence by people who were legally considered property.
It is the core structural contradiction of the American barbecue tradition. You have profound black artistry and immense physical labor made utterly invisible, all in the service of building white communal and political identity.
And as the source material makes incredibly clear, we can't just talk about this as like brute labor.
No, definitely not.
It wasn't just heavy lifting and digging ditches. It was a highly sophisticated culinary science that was imported directly across the Atlantic Ocean.
The text is emphatic about this, and it's a point that really cannot be overstated. No honest account of American barbecue can avoid the truth that the tradition, as we recognize it today, was built primarily by enslaved black people. The pitmasters who laid the foundation for every single regional style we argue about today, they were almost entirely enslaved for the first 2 centuries of the tradition's existence.
And they didn't just arrive on these shores as blank slates either.
No, they brought complex, deep-rooted food knowledge and culinary traditions from West and Central Africa. Sub-Saharan African cuisines were already deeply reliant on smoke and live fire. They had a strong, established preference for slow-cooking, tough cuts of meat. They possessed highly sophisticated spice, curing, and seasoning traditions.
So it wasn't just an accident that they were good at this.
Exactly. This isn't a historical guess. We know through rigorous scholarship that specific regional food cultures from the Senegambian, Congolese, Nigerian, and Ghanaian peoples survived the horrors of the Middle Passage. That knowledge was carried in their memories, in their palates, and in their somatic bodily practices.
Which fundamentally explains the specific cuts of meat we associate with barbecue today. Like think about pork shoulder, spare ribs, beef brisket. By standard European culinary metrics of the time, these were the absolute worst, least desirable parts of the animal, right?
Oh, entirely. They're dense with connective tissue, tough as leather, fatty, really difficult to chew.
So the European enslavers took the prime cuts, the tenderloins, the hams, the easy-to-cook meats for the plantation house.
Yeah.
And the enslaved people were given the literal scraps.
Yeah.
And it's culinary alchemy, taking the absolute toughest, connective tissue-dense parts of an animal and using time, smoke, and ancestral knowledge to turn necessity into absolute culinary transcendence.
And just think about the incredibly strange, fraught social dynamic this created for the enslaved pitmaster. Like on a large plantation or in a colonial town, this person might be the most visible artisan in the community.
Right, because the events were so public.
Exactly. When a wealthy planter hosted a massive political barbecue, his entire social prestige, his political future, really was riding on the quality of that food. So the skill of the enslaved pitmaster was highly, highly valued. They were given a massive amount of operational autonomy during these events.
They're basically running the whole show.
Completely. They were trusted to make complex, split-second decisions about heat management, wood selection, and timing that the enslaver themselves had absolutely no idea how to make.
Mind-boggling when you think about it. They possessed immense prestige for their skill, within the community. They directed these massive culinary operations, yet they possessed absolutely zero legal personhood.
Yeah.
They were undisputed masters of a craft, but that mastery couldn't buy their freedom, it couldn't protect their families, and it certainly didn't earn them public credit in the history books of the time.
But you can see their direct, undeniable influence in the flavor profiles that defined the era, and that still define the regional styles today. I mean, West African food traditions relied heavily on acidic, tangy flavors to balance out rich, fatty meats. Does that sound familiar to anyone who loves Southern barbecue?
Oh, absolutely. Vinegar-forward sauces cutting through rich pork fat. It's the exact same culinary logic.
Exactly. And the heavy use of cayenne pepper, mustard seeds, and pungent black pepper in dry rubs. These are direct analogs to West African spice traditions that utilize native peppers and seeds. Even the preference for cooking the whole animal, utilizing every single part, and using wood ash in the seasoning process, those are distinct echoes of African foodways adapted to a brutal new reality in the American South.
So moving forward in time, after emancipation in 1865, you have this incredibly skilled group of black pitmasters who are finally operating as free agents in the economy. But the text notes that the structural inequalities proved unbelievably resilient, right?
Very much so. Through the Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras, black pitmasters trying to open their own establishments faced terrifying legal hurdles, redlining, and violent extra-legal barriers from white mobs who resented their economic independence.
It was a perilous environment.
But despite that constant threat of arbitrary legal harassment and physical destruction, they built incredible community institutions. The network of black-owned barbecue joints that spread across the South, often just operating out of backyards or small roadside stands, they became essential economic, social, and cultural anchors for Black American life. They were safe spaces.
And then comes one of the most significant demographic shifts in American history, the Great Migration. Between 1910 and 1970, roughly 6 million black Americans moved from the rural, segregated South to industrial cities in the North and West, fleeing racial terror and seeking economic opportunity.
Yeah, and when they moved, they took their fire, their techniques, and their flavors with them. They planted the seeds for entirely new regional styles in places like Chicago, Detroit, and Kansas City.
The regional rivalries we have today are literally the geographical residue of those migration patterns.
They absolutely are. Which brings us perfectly to the heart of the modern barbecue debate, the regional wars.
Oh, this is the best part. The source text has this fantastic subtitle for this section that frames it perfectly. I love the subtitle. It reads, Regional Rivalries, Cultural Identity, the Competition Circuit, and Pit Culture. That really says it all.
It really does.
Because if you ask someone in the South or the Midwest about the best barbecue, you aren't just asking a simple food question. You are inviting them to defend their homeland. You're stepping onto sacred ground. So let's start with what the text calls the ancient kingdom, the Carolinas.
Right. The Carolinas claim the oldest continuous tradition of this European, indigenous, and African synthesis. But if you think there is unity there, you are deeply mistaken.
Yeah, they do not agree with each other.
Not at all. North Carolina and South Carolina are completely distinct culinary universes. And even within North Carolina, there is a legendary, generations-deep blood feud between the East and the West.
So what's Eastern North Carolina doing?
Eastern North Carolina is the oldest style in the country. It is strictly whole hog cooking. The entire pig is split down the middle and laid over the pit. And the sauce is an absolute purist's dream. It's just vinegar, red pepper flakes, salt, and maybe a little sugar to take the edge off. That is it. No tomatoes, no mustard.
The text points out that adding ketchup or tomato paste to an Eastern Carolina sauce is basically considered a culinary crime.
Oh, a felony.
And the logic behind it is brilliant. The vinegar wasn't just for flavor. Historically, before modern refrigeration, the high acidity of the vinegar inhibited bacterial growth on the meat. But culinarily, it's a perfect pairing. The sharp, acidic vinegar slices right through the extreme, overwhelming richness of the rendered whole hog fat. It cleanses the palate with every bite.
Yeah.
Even their coleslaw is dressed with vinegar, not mayonnaise. It's a completely unified, historically logical culinary system.
But then you travel just a bit west to Lexington, North Carolina, the Piedmont region, and the rules completely change.
Total 180.
They abandon the whole hog entirely and focus exclusively on cooking the pork shoulder. And they commit the ultimate Eastern sin. They add ketchup to their vinegar sauce, creating what they call the Lexington dip.
It's red, it's slightly sweet, it's tannier, and it's fiercely defended by its local practitioners.
Yep. And the shift likely happened because the Piedmont region industrialized later and commercially bottled ketchup became widely available and was just adopted into the local flavor profile.
And then South Carolina is just showing off, honestly.
Pretty much.
It's the only state in the union that maintains all four major sauce traditions within its borders: heavy tomato, light tomato, vinegar, and their completely unique masterpiece, the Midland's mustard-based sauce. Let's talk about the why here. Why mustard in South Carolina?
Geography and immigration. The text explains that this Midlands mustard sauce, which is bright yellow, sharp, made of yellow cultural intersection. In the 1730s to 1750s, there was a massive influx of German immigrant communities to the central part of the state.
Oh, and Germans love mustard and pork.
Exactly. They brought their traditional love of mustard and pork, and that European preference intersected directly with the African-American pitmasters who were actually cooking the meat.
That intersection of cultures, German butchers and black pitmasters, is a perfect segue to the beef empire, Texas. Because if you ask a casual observer or someone who just watches food television, they think Texas barbecue is just one monolithic thing.
Yeah, but the text aggressively debunks the myth of a singular Texas style.
Right, because Texas is basically its own continent, and the geography dictates the food. The style that dominates the national media, the one with the massive lines around the block in Austin, is Central Texas style. We're talking mammoth beef briskets smoked over post oak wood with a starkly simple kosher salt and coarse black pepper rub. And historically, absolutely no sauce whatsoever.
None. And in many traditional Central Texas joints, asking for sauce can actually be taken as a direct insult to the pitmaster. You're implying the meat is dry and needs masking.
Which is a bold stance.
It is, and this specific style traces back to 19th century German and Czech butcher shops in towns like Lockhart and Luling. Before refrigeration, these butchers used smoke to preserve whatever leftover meat they couldn't sell raw. They just sold it on simple butcher paper with crackers, pickles, and raw onions.
But again, the text corrects the historical record here. While the European immigrants owned the markets, this smoking tradition was heavily maintained, perfected, and evolved by black pitmasters who worked in the back rooms and later ran their own market-style joints during segregation, a fact that mainstream food media ignored for decades.
Right. And if you leave Central Texas, the rules completely change again because the landscape changes. East Texas style is heavily pork-focused, drawing directly on Deep South and Louisiana traditions. They use sweet, tomato-heavy sauces, and the meat is cooked until it completely falls off the bone, which a Central Texas purist would call overcooked.
Oh, fighting words.
Totally. And then West Texas is an arid scrubland. Post-oak doesn't grow there. So they cook over mesquite wood, which Central Texas purists often hate because it burns incredibly hot and can impart a bitter, acrid flavor if you aren't careful. And because it's sheep country, they incorporate mutton and goat. South Texas leans heavily into its Mexican roots, featuring barbacoa traditions, originally cooking cow heads in underground pits.
We really need to focus on the brisket for a moment, though, because as the text notes, it has become the most culturally loaded, fetishized cut of meat in America.
Oh, absolutely. And brisket is an absolute nightmare to cook.
Why is it so hard?
It's the pectoral muscle of a massive 1,000-pound animal. It is heavily worked, supporting the animal's weight, and is incredibly dense with connective tissue. To make it tender, a pitmaster has to maintain incredibly precise temperatures, usually around 225 to 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 12 to 16 unbroken hours.
Wow, that's exhausting.
They have to perfectly manage the airflow, the moisture in the pit, and develop the bark, that deeply seasoned, caramelized, smoky crust on the outside. It is a legitimate feat of thermal engineering and physical endurance.
Okay, moving from the beef empire to the crossroads.
Yeah.
Kansas City. Kansas City is the great ecumenical equalizer. They don't restrict themselves to one animal or one cut. Beef, pork, chicken, turkey, sausage, they cook it all.
Yeah. And the reason why is geography again. Kansas City was the great railroad hub and the epicenter of the Midwestern meatpacking industry.
Yeah.
Every type of livestock flowed through their stockyards.
But their defining, unifying feature is that thick, sweet tomato and molasses-based sauce. If you go to a grocery store anywhere in the world and buy a generic bottle labeled BBQ sauce, you are buying a direct descendant of the Kansas City flavor profile.
And that iconic style was born directly from the Great Migration. The text highlights Henry Perry, an African-American entrepreneur from the Deep South who started selling smoked meats wrapped in newspaper from a street stand in Kansas City around 1908. He cooked in a pit dug right into the ground. He trained a lineage of pit masters, including the legendary Arthur Bryant, who smoothed out Perry's fiery sauce and essentially defined the city's modern culinary culture.
I love the story of the burnt ends. It is my favorite anecdote in this section. Kansas City's most famous culinary export started as literal trash.
Yeah, it's amazing.
The burnt, heavily caramelized fatty edges of the brisket point were considered unsellable. Pit masters would just chop them off and leave them on the counter to give away for free as scraps to customers who were waiting in line. Then the famous food writer Calvin Trillin wrote a glowing piece about how incredible these crispy, fatty nuggets were in the 1970s. Suddenly, overnight, these free scraps became a premium, highly sought-after menu item that restaurants run out of by noon.
It perfectly illustrates how these iconic traditions evolve organically from necessity and waste.
And rounding out the Four Kingdoms, we have Memphis, Tennessee, the undisputed rib capital.
Right. Memphis sits right on the Mississippi River, which made it a massive hub for the river trade, bringing in diverse spices and molasses. And Memphis is defined by the fierce internal war between wet and dry ribs.
Okay, break that down for us.
So dry ribs get a complex, heavily layered spice rub before cooking and absolutely no sauce, letting the interplay of the smoke and the spices shine. Wet ribs are heavily sauced during the end of the cook and after, creating the sticky, caramelized lacquer. Memphis also leans heavily into pulled pork sandwiches, often topped with coleslaw, and their sauce sits right in the middle of the spectrum. Sweeter and thicker than Carolina vinegar, but tannier and thinner than Kansas City molasses.
I want to spend a few minutes on the outliers the text mentions, rather than just rapid-firing them, because they really show how wildly vast and adaptive this landscape is.
Yeah, they're fascinating.
Take Alabama white sauce. It sounds insane to a purist. A barbecue sauce made of mayonnaise.
It sounds so wrong.
Right. But it was invented in the 1920s by Big Bob Gibson. Chicken is lean and dries out quickly in a smoker. So he created a sauce of mayonnaise, vinegar, apple juice, and black pepper. You dunk the smoked chicken in it, the fat in the mayonnaise coats the meat, and the vinegar provides the tang. It is functionally brilliant.
It is brilliant chemical engineering for lean meat.
Yeah.
And then you have Kentucky, which has a massive tradition of smoking mutton adult sheep.
Which is unusual.
Very. But it developed because Kentucky was a massive wool-producing state in the 19th century. When the sheep grew too old to produce good wool, they had to be eaten. Mutton is incredibly tough and has a very strong, gamey flavor. So they developed a black dippa sauce, heavily reliant on Worcestershire sauce and allspice, to mask the gaminess and tenderize the tough meat over huge hickory pits.
Then you jump to the West Coast. California has its own unique backyard asada culture, specifically in places like Los Angeles, which beautifully blends Mexican immigrant traditions of marinated grilled meats with post-war suburban backyard aesthetics. And way out in the Pacific, Hawaii has Kalua pork.
Oh, that's an incredible method.
They cook whole pigs in an underground pit called an imu, lined with hot rocks and banana leaves. It is a completely parallel, ancient, indigenous slow-cooking tradition that achieves the exact same tender, smoky result without ever interacting with the Southern American tradition.
It just goes to show humans figure out how to master fire everywhere. But to really appreciate how any of these regional variations work, we have to look under the hood. We have to understand the underlying science, which the source material goes into with fascinating granular detail. It calls this section the science of metaphysics of the pit.
We're talking about chemistry operating on an entirely different timescale than standard kitchen cooking. Let's break down the Maillard reaction, because everyone talks about it, but few understand how it changes in a smoker.
Right. So in high heat cooking, like searing a ribeye steak on a cast iron skillet, the Maillard reaction happens in minutes. It is the chemical reaction between amino acids and reducing sugars that causes browning and creates hundreds of new flavor compounds.
But in a barbecue pit.
In a pit, running low and slow between 225 and 275 degrees, that exact same reaction takes hours to unfold. And because it happens so slowly, it allows for a massive accumulation of complex secondary and tertiary flavor compounds that you simply cannot replicate in an oven or on a hot, fast grill. It's a slow-motion flavor explosion.
And while that complex flavor is developing on the surface, you have an incredible structural transformation happening inside the meat. We mentioned connective tissue earlier. That tissue is primarily made of a protein called collagen.
Right, which is tough.
It's what makes raw meat tough to chew. It holds the muscle fibers tightly together. But when collagen is heated to around 160 degrees Fahrenheit in a moist environment for a sustained period, it undergoes a process called hydrolysis. It literally unravels and converts into gelatin.
Yes. And that silky, melting, rich gelatin coats the muscle fibers from the inside out and creates that incredible pull-apart tenderness.
Which you absolutely cannot rush.
No, if you crank up the heat to 400 degrees, the muscle fibers just contract, squeeze out all their water, and you're left with a dry, unchewable brick. The time is a mandatory, non-negotiable variable.
Okay, what about the famous smoke ring? The text points out how controversial this has become. For anyone who doesn't know, the smoke ring is that beautiful, vivid pink halo right under the dark crust of a sliced piece of smoked meat.
Oh, the smoke ring. Yeah.
For decades, competition judges and backyard enthusiasts treated the smoke ring as the ultimate visual proof of a perfect, authentic smoke. But the chemistry is wild. It has nothing to do with smoke flavor.
It really doesn't.
It's actually caused by a compound called nitrosomoglobin. Nitrogen oxides from the burning wood gases dissolve into the moisture on the surface of the meat, and they react with the myoglobin, the protein that gives raw meat its red color, to lock in that pink hue before the heat can turn it brown.
Exactly. And because it is simply a chemical reaction, it can be entirely faked. People quickly figured out how to use curing salts like sodium nitrite or specific chemical environments to force a deep, beautiful pink ring without actually slow smoking the meat properly over wood.
That feels like cheating.
It is. The text notes that modern educated judges know the smoke ring is an entirely unreliable metric for actual quality or smoke penetration. But as a culture, we're still completely visually obsessed with it. We eat with our eyes first.
All right, if you have ever tried to smoke a big piece of meat, you have to explain the stall. Because for anyone who has ever tried to smoke a pork butt or a brisket in their backyard for the first time, the stall is absolutely a terrifying psychological experience.
Oh, it breaks people.
You start at 6 a.m., you're watching the digital thermometer climb steadily, everything's going great, and then it hits roughly 150 or 160 degrees, and it just stops for hours. 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours. The temperature just will not rise a single degree.
It induces absolute panic in novices. They think the fire is dying or their thermometer is broken. So what do? They panic. They throw on a ton of more wood. They crank up the heat and they completely dry out and ruin their meat.
So what's actually happening?
The stall is just simple thermodynamics. It is evaporative cooling. As the internal moisture of the meat gets hot, it migrates to the surface and evaporates. This acts exactly like human sweat. When you run a marathon, you sweat. The sweat evaporates and it cools your skin down, preventing you from overheating.
Oh, wow. So the meat is sweating.
The meat is doing the exact same thing. The heat energy from your fire is being entirely consumed by evaporating the water on the surface of the meat, so the internal temperature flatlines. The meat is literally sweating to fight off the heat of the fire.
That sweat metaphor makes it so perfectly clear. So how do the pros handle this standoff between the fire and the meat?
There are two main ways. You either have the meditative, Zen-like patience to just wait it out. You keep the fire steady, and eventually the surface moisture depletes enough that the evaporative cooling stops and the temperature starts rising again. Or you use what is famously known as the Texas crutch.
The Texas crutch.
Yeah, you take the meat off the pit and wrap it tightly in butcher paper or heavy aluminum foil. This traps the moisture, completely stops the evaporation process, and pushes the meat through the stall much faster. To wrap or not to wrap, and whether to use foil or breathable butcher paper, is one of the great heated theological debates in modern barbecue.
And all of this complex chemistry and thermodynamics is happening inside a piece of equipment that practically requires an engineering degree to fully understand.
Oh, definitely.
The fluid dynamics of managing airflow in an offset smoker, where the fire is in a separate box attached to the side, versus a reverse flow smoker, which uses massive steel baffle plates to force the smoke under the meat and then back over it, are incredibly intense. But the author makes a beautiful pivot here from the hard science to what they call the metaphysics of the pit.
Yeah, this is where it gets really beautiful.
Because you cannot just read a textbook or listen to us explain the chemistry and suddenly become a pit master. It is somatic knowledge, right? It lives in the body, not the brain.
Yes, somatic knowledge is the perfect term for it. It is knowing when a massive brisket is ready, not by looking at a digital meat thermometer, but by the specific hollow sound it makes when you thump it with your finger, or the way it yields when you press it. It is knowing the fire in the firebox needs more air, not by checking a gauge, but just by glancing at the exact shade of blue or gray in the smoke billowing from the stack.
That's example.
Exactly. It's an intuitive bodily rhythm that only comes from hundreds and hundreds of hours of sleep deprivation, stinging eyes, and quiet watchfulness. It is almost a spiritual practice of patience and observation.
Which makes the historical erasure of the Black Pitmaster so much more painful when you realize the level of mastery required. The text dedicates a significant, sobering section to how the 20th century food media, the glossy magazines, the early TV shows, the major newspapers, was overwhelmingly white.
Yeah.
And they consistently centered white experiences, essentially writing the Black creators and masters of this tradition out of their own history. They framed it as a rustic hobby for white suburbanites rather than an ancestral craft developed by Black Americans.
It was a systemic erasure. It really wasn't until the 2010s that we saw a real mainstream corrective wave, heavily driven by brilliant scholars and journalists like Adrian Miller and Michael Twitty. They did the rigorous archival historical work to make the Black barbecue tradition, which, by the way, had never stopped existing, it was just ignored, visible to the mainstream media conversation that had actively marginalized it for decades.
And this brings up a really painful economic irony that I think we need to explore deeper. The text discusses the gentrification of smoke.
This is a heavy part of the chapter.
It really is. You have these historic Black-owned barbecue joints in places like Kansas City or the east side of Austin that have anchored their communities for 60 years.
Yeah.
But because of systemic financial inequalities, they struggle to secure basic bank loans to fix a leaky roof or upgrade a smoker.
Right.
Meanwhile, a young white chef opens a high-concept Brooklyn-style barbecue spot a few blocks away in the same gentrifying neighborhood, and immediately gets millions in venture capital, glowing national press in food magazines, and James Beard nominations.
It is a stark reality. It is the exact same structural inequality that exists in housing, in tech, in every sector of the American economy, just laid bare on a plate. The media and financial apparatus are historically organized to amplify and fund white practitioners while diminishing or ignoring Black ones.
But I want to push back on how we frame the solution, because even when Black pitmasters do get the media spotlight, aren't they often boxed into these incredibly frustrating authenticity traps?
Oh, absolutely.
Like if a white chef experiments with a new Asian fusion rub on a brisket, he is hailed as a culinary genius pushing the boundaries. But if a Black pitmaster innovates or deviates from the historic Southern menu, media gatekeepers suddenly declare they aren't being authentic to their roots.
It's a massive, suffocating double standard. As the text points out, it stems from the biased assumption that Black barbecue is only valuable as a historical artifact of struggle, rather than as a living, breathing, continuously evolving creative practice.
That makes total sense.
It's exactly how early cultural critics treated jazz or hip-hop. They want the soulful history, they want the aesthetic of struggle, but they refuse to grant the Black practitioner the artistic license to innovate, experiment, and exceed the boundaries of that history.
That dynamic is perfectly illustrated when we look at the rise of the modern celebrity pitmaster. The text sets up a fascinating contrast here. Aaron Franklin in Austin is the ultimate modern archetype.
Right, the line around the block guy.
Yeah, and he is brilliant, don't get me wrong. He applies a highly academic, scientific approach to brisket. He writes meticulously detailed books, he wins James Beard Awards, people wait in the line in lawn chairs for 5 hours just to taste his food. He elevated the craft in the public eye to fine dining status. But compare his media trajectory to someone like Rodney Scott.
Right. Rodney Scott's story is entirely different. He grew up splitting wood and cooking whole hogs at his family's humble roadside joint in Hemingway, South Carolina. He started tending the fires when he was just 11 years old. We are talking about decades of unglamorous, grueling physical mastery in the sweltering heat.
Not exactly a glamorous startup story.
Not at all. But it was only when he eventually partnered with professional backers to open a sleek, beautifully designed restaurant in gentrifying Charleston that the national media swooped in. He eventually became the first Black pitmaster to win a James Beard Award for Best Chef. The mainstream recognition only followed the packaging and the location, even though the unparalleled substance and mastery were always there in Hemingway.
I think my favorite person mentioned in the entire text, the one who just shatters all these narratives, is Tootsie Tominitz of Snow's BBQ in Lexington, Texas.
She is a legend.
She's an octogenarian woman. She is in her late 80s. And she is out there at 2 in the morning on a Saturday, physically splitting oak wood and shoveling hot coals to manage these massive pits. She completely shatters the media's current archetype of the young, bearded, tattooed, scientifically minded pitmaster. She proves that true, undeniable mastery doesn't need formal culinary credentials or venture capital. It just needs a half-century of somatic dedication to the fire.
Her story is incredible, and it also stands in stark contrast to another massive cultural shift. The rise of barbecue as a hyper-regimented sport. The text dives deep into the competition circuit, which over the last 40 years has completely changed the landscape of American barbecue.
Barbecue as a sport. To an outsider, it sounds ridiculous until you realize just how massive and lucrative it is. Organizations like the Kansas City Barbecue Society, or KCBS, sanction over 500 events a year globally. Memphis in May is this globally recognized massive championship.
And it's intense.
It has spawned this bizarre alternative universe. People are no longer just using converted oil drums. They are pulling up to these competitions in custom-built $100,000 cooking rigs mounted on massive trailers with satellite TVs and sleeping quarters. It is a massive technological arms race.
And this arms race has created what traditionalists openly despise, the competition profile. Think about how a blind tasting competition actually works. A judge sitting in a tent takes exactly one bite of your entry from a little styrofoam box lined with bright green parsley.
Just one bite?
You have one single bite to completely overwhelm their palate and stand out from the 50 other samples they're eating that day.
So any concept of subtlety or nuance just goes right out the window.
Completely out the window. To win that one bite, the meat is heavily injected with liquid butter, concentrated broths, and chemical phosphates to achieve this hypersaturated, almost artificial tenderness and moisture. The sauces are made aggressively, overwhelmingly sweet, because sugar triggers an immediate positive psychological and physiological response in the judge's brain.
Oh wow, they're hacking the judge's brain.
Basically, yeah. The appearance of the meat is lacquered to a high gloss, so it shines in the box. It is incredibly skilled, precise cooking, but many traditional pitmasters argue it barely resembles actual barbecue anymore. It is closer to savory meat candy, designed for a rumik, not a meal designed to be eaten on a plate with potato salad.
The text also touches on the gender dynamics here, which are fascinating and often overlooked. The competition circuit and modern barbecue culture in general is so heavily coded as a masculine domain. The guy with the beer, the tongs, standing over the fire defending his grill. But the text argues this is actually a massive historical erasure of Black women's domestic cooking.
It is a double erasure. Historically, enslaved and free Black women were foundational to the domestic and communal slow-cooking traditions that birthed barbecue. They were managing the fires, the seasonings, and the sides.
So how did it become so male-dominated in the public eye?
Well, post-World War II, companies like Weber and Kingsford aggressively marketed the backyard grill specifically to the suburban white dad. They completely domesticated and privatized what used to be a communal, community-wide process and explicitly coded it as male leisure to sell charcoal briquettes and aluminum grills to the booming suburbs.
And now, that masculine coding and the obsession with visual perfection from the competition circuit has been massively amplified by the internet. The text tracks this technological shift perfectly. It used to be that you only learned barbecue through direct, years-long apprenticeship in your local community. You learned your region's style and nothing else.
Right, it was hyper-local.
But then the internet arrived. Web forums like the BBQ Brethren in the early 2000s allowed a guy in Ohio to troubleshoot his fire management in real time with a grand champion in Texas.
It completely democratized the technical knowledge. Suddenly, regional secrets were global knowledge. But it also unleashed YouTube tutorials, and worse, the Instagram obsession with what the text calls brisket porn.
Brisket porn. I laughed out loud when I read that.
It's a real thing.
It is. It's the obsession with getting the perfect high-definition cross-section shot of a sliced brisket. You squeeze it so the rendered fat oozes out for the camera. You show off the vibrant pink smoke ring, all just to get likes on social media. It actually changed the economics of the restaurant industry. Well, restaurants that make visually photogenic food win the social media algorithm, drawing huge crowds, even if the humble, unglamorous, poorly lit joint down the street actually tastes significantly better. You are cooking for the camera now, not the palate.
And then the COVID-19 pandemic poured absolute gasoline on this digital fire. Millions of people were stuck at home looking for hobbies that took up a lot of time. They took up backyard smoking en masse. Manufacturers of pellet smokers and offset rigs literally could not keep up with demand. There were massive supply chain shortages. It vastly expanded the community of enthusiasts, but it also intensified the vicious online debates over authenticity and technique.
Speaking of fierce debates, let's talk about the political theater of meat. Because as we cover the political aspects from the text, I want to be clear for you, the listener, that the author is analyzing this purely as a cultural phenomenon, looking at how politicians use food as a tool. We're not taking sides here. Politicians have always used barbecue to signal that they are authentic, anti-elite, and in touch with real America. It is a costume they put on.
It is a profound semiotic marker in American politics. The text uses George W. Bush as a prime example. He frequently used barbecue events at his Crawford Ranch in Texas to project a highly specific image: the president in cowboy boots and jeans serving smoked meat to foreign dignitaries.
Right, it's very calculated.
It signaled a grounded vernacular, no-nonsense set of values to his political constituency. Barack Obama, conversely, had to navigate a much more complex semiotic minefield.
Also,
Well, he frequently visited famous barbecue joints on the campaign trail, but as a black president engaging with a tradition that was built on black labor but had been publicly recoded as white masculine, his presence required a very careful, highly scrutinized navigation of those cultural symbols. Every bite was analyzed.
and those political arguments bleed right into the looming environmental clash.
Yeah.
Because you have the ethical dilemma of traditional whole hog barbecue relying heavily on massive industrial pork production, which has devastating environmental impacts.
Yeah, that's a huge issue now.
The alternative is using ethically raised, pasture-roaming heritage hogs, but that makes the final product so expensive that it prices out the working-class communities that invented the food. But even more pressingly, you have the carbon footprint and air quality issues of burning cord after cord of hardwood.
This is becoming a major legal battlefield.
Right.
In places like California, stringent air pollution regulations have forced historic, traditional wood-burning pits to completely shut down, install massively expensive scrubbers, or dramatically alter their methods. It is a genuine, difficult clash between modern public health imperatives and historical cultural preservation.
Which leads to the Great Civil War over pellet smokers. If you've been to a hardware store recently, you've seen them. These are electric devices that automatically feed compressed wood dust pellets into a fire pot to maintain absolute perfect temperatures via a computer chip. You can control them with an app on your phone.
They're incredibly popular.
Environmentalists and health departments might prefer them because they burn cleaner, and amateurs love the sheer convenience. But traditionalists view them as an existential threat to the soul of the craft. They argue vehemently that if you aren't managing a live fire, if you aren't making active, physical decisions about airflow, humidity, and combustion, you aren't a pit master. You are just operating a smoky outdoor oven.
It asks the fundamental philosophical question of the entire text. Is the tradition of barbecue solely about the final flavor of the meat on the plate, or is it fundamentally about the human process of mastery, attention, and communion with the fire?
That question gets even more wonderfully complex as American barbecue goes global. The text details how this highly regional American food has spread across the world. It has taken root in Australia, where they are adapting it by using native ironbark wood and incorporating their own indigenous earth-cooking traditions.
And Japan.
Yes, it has exploded in Japan, where the cultural reverence for patient, meticulous, repetitive craft makes them absolutely perfect custodians for Central Texas brisket techniques. And South Korea is creating brilliant fusions, using traditional hickory smoke, but incorporating flavors like gochujang and kimchi into the rubs and sauces.
It is incredible culinary diplomacy, but looking to the future, the text speculates on a genuinely wild science fiction frontier: cellular agriculture, lab-grown meat.
Oh, this part absolutely blew my mind. I never considered this intersection.
If the technology advances to the point where we can cultivate affordable, mass-produced beef or pork tissue in a bioreactor without ever slaughtering an animal, what happens to barbecue? Can lab-grown meat ever genuinely replicate the complex, heavily worked connective tissues, the fat caps, and the collagen that are biologically required for low and slow smoking? Can a lab grow a brisket that stalls?
And even if science can physically replicate the perfect brisket in a lab, does the culture survive? If barbecue is a living language of American history, born from the harsh realities of survival, whole animal utilization, and the physical somatic mastery of wood fire, what happens when climate realities and technological shifts force us entirely away from open wood fires and massive livestock consumption?
That's the big question.
Does the culture survive the loss of the physical fire, or does it evolve into something entirely new and unrecognizable? That is a profound, slightly melancholic thought to sit with. If you remove the physical fire, do you extinguish the soul of the tradition?
It is a profound question without an easy answer, but pondering it proves exactly what we established at the very beginning of this conversation. Barbecue is never, ever just about food. It is the lens through which we navigate our history, our resources, our sins, and our identity as a society.
Which is exactly why this deep dive has been so incredibly vital. And I am so excited to finally reveal to you where all of this incredible paradigm-shifting analysis comes from. This massive exploration into the cultural, racial, and historical fault lines of American BBQ is actually derived from the very first book of an absolutely stunning, monumental 30-volume series. The series is called To Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America. And this specific deep dive, this entire conversation, comes from the book titled Volume 1, America's Healthcare Crisis in Broken Public Institutions, authored by Sue B. Howell. It is a brilliant structural choice by the author. It is fascinating how exploring broken public institutions, looking at systemic failures, invisible labor, and regional divides, requires us to first understand the deep societal structures mapped out in something as seemingly simple and everyday as barbecue. It sets the perfect metaphorical stage for the rest of the book.
It is a truly brilliant piece of writing that connects the micro to the macro in ways you would never expect. And this phenomenal book is now available in all Amazon bookstores across the world. We highly encourage you to go check out the book, buy it on Amazon, and dive into these complex, foundational issues yourself. Please leave comments and feedback. It is a conversation that absolutely needs to keep going as we try to understand the fabric of this country.
The pit is still burning, and it's up to all of us to understand the complex stories told around it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.